gave all that you are, that we may be all that you are. Your righteousness is ours because of what you've done, not because of what we've done, not even because of a decision we've made. Lord, you gave us the faith to believe. Father, you are worthy, worthy, worthy to be praised, honored, glorified in this place. And what's awesome, Lord, is you're not finished. There's so much more you have for us, even in this hour. Lord, as we dig into your word, as we celebrate your sacrifice, overwhelm us, God, with your presence. Help us to know you as we are known by you. And we pray it, Lord, in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. Y'all be seated.
Starting a brand new work will always promise opportunities and challenges. For instance, let's take creation. That is a new work, right? Creation, God in 6 days spoke the heavens and the earth, the entire universe, all the planets, the galaxies, solar systems, 6 days spoke it into existence, but not long, and that was a great opportunity. But not long after that, sin entered the world, what we might call a very, very difficult challenge. How about the nation of Israel? That was a new work. When it began with Abram in Genesis chapter 12, God called Abram out of his homeland. Abram obeyed, brought his family, took off. What an amazing opportunity. But Abram, in doubt, went to Egypt, lied about his wife, almost allowed her to get into an immoral relationship with the king. And what a challenge. But then Abram became very wealthy. He inherited Canaan land. What a great opportunity. But then his nephew Lot fell into captivity, went into a sinful city that he chose for his lodging place. And that became a great challenge. So challenges and opportunities. The ministry of Jesus called his 12 to follow him and was baptized. Began a brand new ministry, right? What an opportunity. But then he began to be doubted by his own home folk. Folks who ultimately tried to kill him. He didn't allow himself to be killed because it wasn't time, and that was a challenge. Then how about Peter in Jesus' ministry? Claimed that Jesus was the Christ. Victorious statement by Peter. That was a great opportunity, but not long after that, Peter denied Christ. What a great challenge. Anytime we begin something new, a new ministry, a new calling, a new church, a new ministry within that church, we can expect challenges and we can expect opportunities. We can expect victories and we can expect defeats. Starting a new ministry or a new work, particularly in the midst of a lost culture, will contain challenges and opportunities. And so today, by God's grace, we are going to take some time to consider what challenges and opportunities that we might expect. The book of Acts, once again, is where we are. The book of Acts, chapter 18. Speaking of something new, we're in a new chapter for the first time in a while. The book of Acts, chapter 18. We are now with Paul as he enters into a brand new ministry opportunity in a city known as Corinth. If you'll recall, he was in the region of Macedonia. He worked his way south from Philippi to Thessalonica to Berea to Athens, continued south into a region known as Achaia. And in Achaia is the major city of Corinth. Corinth was both a wealthy city because of the trade routes. Corinth was a trade route east and west and north and south. Very, very few cities could claim that. It was a trade route on land and on sea. Corinth was, at this time, when Paul showed up there, one of the most economically strategic cities in the Roman Empire. And I am not overstating that. In fact, there was such commerce that you had trade coming through and people gaining great wealth in a city like you normally would in a place like that, but also a lot of poverty. You had people bringing lots of ideas. You had gross immorality. You had a massive altar, if you will, temple, dedicated to a goddess whose part of her religious worship was 1,000 temple prostitutes who would come out of the temple each night and descend down into Corinth to ply their trade. That was part of the temple worship. So you can imagine all the things that go with a metropolis, all the New York Cities and San Francisco's and Los Angeles and even Atlanta's and all of the corruption you could think of in a large city, in a city full of commerce, in a city full of people, in a city full of trade, you can place in the city of Corinth. And Paul would show up there. He would show up there beginning a brand new work. And today we're going to consider some challenges, difficulties, and opportunities that we might expect in a brand new work. Adventures in starting a new work is the title of today's message, picking up in Acts chapter 18. We will go all the way through verse 17 of this chapter today, so let's get started beginning in verse 1. And it reads, after these things. And when you see a reference like that, don't just slip past it. Pause for a moment, and this is a Bible study principle. Pause for a moment and say, okay, what are these things? Because verse 1 says, after these things, well, what are these things? These things, in this case, is referring to the activity that took place in Athens. The preaching on the Areopagus, the false idols in Athens. Paul's there. Paul left Athens, I would expect, tired. He left alone. Timothy and Silas had been left behind in Berea to wrap things up. He left Athens with a few believers, but many of whom rejected the gospel. He left Athens having been made fun of, criticized, and persecuted, verbally in particular, by some of the Athenians. And so as he shows up in Corinth, it has been a lot of highs and a lot of lows as Paul arrives there. Corinth was a city that was rebuilt by Julius Caesar in 46 BC, which would have been now some 70 to 80 years prior to Paul showing up there. Paul's visit, as he arrived there, with the seamen and the commerce that were all there, the sailors coming through, the influence of Aphrodite, which is the temple I mentioned. As Paul showed up in the city, I want to show you something that might intrigue you just a bit. Hold your place here in the book of Acts and flip over for just a moment to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians. Now, 1 Corinthians is written years after Paul established the church in Corinth. Let me point something out. In the book of Acts, we read the establishing of the churches. In the epistles, we read Paul writing letters to these same churches years later. I just taught a class, team taught with Reverend Kenny Peters, who many of you know, and we taught it on the epistles of Paul. And the book that we used, part of it walked through the book of Acts, and with each church that was begun in the book of Acts, like Philippi, we also walked through the letter to the Philippians. So we looked at Paul's starting of the churches, and we looked at the letters he sent to the churches later on. Well, here in Acts 18, Paul is starting the church in Corinth, right? And many of you might think that the Apostle Paul was kind of a superhero, which he kind of was. Many of you might think that the Apostle Paul was some kind of a superhuman spiritual hero. I want to show you something in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 1, Paul says, and this is years later, right? He's writing to the Corinthians. He's thinking back on that day when he showed up in Corinth. Many of you may be thinking, well, Paul showed up in Corinth. He was ready to just clean house, right? He was ready to just knock some things down, preach the gospel, extend an invitation, see people saved, and get things started. Watch this. And I, brethren, verse 1, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom declaring to you the testimony of God. He could have come that way. He could have come and blown them away with his ability to speak, his oratorical skills, and his ability to debate. But that's not how he came to Corinth. He said, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. So I didn't want you believing because of my ability to convince. I wanted you believing because of the cross of Christ. Verse 3, I was with you in strength and power, and I was a superhero, right? Man, I came in there ready to wipe that place out. Wasn't nobody going to stand up to the gospel I had to preach, right? He says, I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. Paul walked into Corinth tired and worn out, about to start a new work. He did not come with zeal and zest. He came worn out, he came beaten down, and he came, quite frankly, fearful. He walked into this city by himself. Las Vegas, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, all the major cities. Think of all the things that take place in all these cities. And he walked in, and his knees were shaking. Thankfully, they wore robes so nobody could see. But Paul was afraid. Well, Pastor, I thought we weren't given a spirit of fear. We're not. That's why Paul said, I came to preach the power of the cross. Because if I came in my own power, it wouldn't have been much at that time. That's why when we begin a new work, by the way, you don't have to begin a new work with some kind of a fearless attitude. You don't have to begin a new work with some kind of an idea that you're going to conquer. You don't have to be the best. You don't have to be the brightest. You just have to be available to be used by God. And that was Paul. And so verse 1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens. I'm back in Acts now, 18. Sorry, Acts 18. Let's go back there. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus. By the way, from Athens to Achaia was about a 50-mile walk, so you can imagine. Maybe that's why Paul was tired. 50 miles. How many of you have walked 50 miles, except for Vanessa? I know she's run 50 miles, but all the rest of the normal people here have never walked 50 miles. She runs those 100-mile races, you know. Whew. But Paul, this is just in his normal everyday thing. He walked 50 miles. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy, that is Rome. That's the capital, right? His wife's name was Priscilla. Aquila and Priscilla had moved to Corinth from Rome. Rome was the capital. Rome was the place to be. They had lived there. They had moved from Rome, Italy, to Corinth. Okay, good deal. They decided to move. Well, Priscilla and Aquila, did you move maybe because of a job or maybe a business opportunity? Why did you move to Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila? Verse 2, parenthetically, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. How many of you in your translations, that is a parenthetical statement? That is, there are parentheses around it. I just find that so intriguing. That something that is really such a big deal, the Bible treats as parentheses. Now we know the Scriptures are God's Word and God's heart and God's mind, so there are no errors. And what this shows you is that the parenthetical statement is not the primary point here. But this parenthetical statement is a powerful statement. What happened to Priscilla and Aquila? The government came to their house, banged on the door, and told them they had to get out of town. Why? Because they were Jewish. No other reason. Because of their race, because of their background, because of their cultural identity, they were forced to pick up everything and leave Rome. I don't want to brush past this parenthetical statement, because you have a couple here who had, and it doesn't say how long it had been, but it could not have been that long, looking at historical references and who was the Claudius who caused this to happen. It could not have been a very long amount of time. Let me ask you a question. If tomorrow the government came to your door with military soldiers, banged on your door and says you have 1 week to get out of town because you're tall, because you're a Christian, because you're short. You have 1 week to get out of town because you're Jewish. You have 1 week to get out of town because you're a Christian. You have 1 week to get out of town because you're black. You have 1 week to get out of town because you're white. You have 1 week to get out of town because you have a lot of hair, because you have no hair. Whatever the reason is, if someone came to your house tomorrow from the government, military soldiers with them, banging on your door and said, you got a week to clear out of town, simply because of who you are, because of your race. And a couple of years later, what would your life be like? I mean, would you be so devastated and so bitter and so angry that you just lost your way? Would you be angry at God? Would you be mad that God allowed something like that, you a Christian, to happen to you? I'm going to suggest to you that Priscilla and Aquila had this devastating thing happen to them. Folks, they were real people. And while this happened 2,000 years ago, let's not forget the fact that if that happened to us today, how long would that take you to get over? How long would it take you to die to the bitterness, to die to the unforgiveness, to die to the anger? Some of you are still holding on to bitterness for things that happened to you decades ago that weren't nearly as bad as this. And it's keeping you from moving forward spiritually, by the way. And I look at Priscilla and Aquila. In verse 3 it says, so because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. They took in Paul. Here's what that says. They were believers. They were doing ministry to such a degree that when Paul showed up, they took him in. He lived with them. He stayed with them. They made tents together while he preached the gospel. Hey, listen, this couple, as far as we know, we're going to see more about them, by the way. We're going to see how God uses their marriage. Oh, I can't wait. Here in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at how Priscilla and Aquila are used by God in their marriage. You do know marriage is as much a tool of the Great Commission as any relationship on earth. Marriage is meant to be an evangelistic vessel to win people to Christ and to point them to God. And Priscilla and Aquila used their marriage that way. They were not walking around pouting and bitter and angry and sharing all the grievances that had been perpetrated against them from the Roman government. They weren't running around angry. They were finding opportunities to minister. Look at verse 7. And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next to the door to the synagogue. He got kicked out of the synagogue, and so he came next door to Justus. So in just a few verses, watch this, in just a few verses, as Paul begins a brand new ministry in Corinth, we meet Priscilla, we meet Aquila, and we meet Justus. Those are just three of the number of people we'll meet. So are you ready for this? When you begin to get involved in new ministry, part of the opportunity you have is a fresh fellowship. The opportunity for fresh fellowship. Too often we view fellowship as just something where we sit down around the table and we share meals together. And don't get me wrong, fellowship is certainly that, right? This morning in Sunday school, we talked about the fellowship of prayer, how prayer is very much a part of our fellowship that is bringing us together. But make no mistake about it, part of your fellowship in this church is plugging yourself into ministries, sometimes new opportunities, sometimes new ministries, sometimes new actions or endeavors, things that you might not have ever considered yourself doing. And one of the things I love about ministry in the church is you'll see people get involved in a ministry who are different ages, different backgrounds, different races, different cultures, and they're all pulling the same way. And those people, in many cases, would never have crossed paths or developed a relationship before in any other sector of life. And yet, because God does what He does through the church, they have established a fellowship with people they never would have before that. I'm now heading toward 14 years being the senior pastor here at Green Acres. And in this amount of time, I can promise you, there have been opportunities and victories, and there have been challenges, and there have been defeats. There have been mountaintops, and there have been valleys along the way as I have pastored this church. But one thing I have learned, there are certain people in this church body who have been here together, and we have served together in places and experiences and ministries that caused challenge in our lives, that caused obstacles that we had to move past, that before us, because of ministries we're involved in, challenges we did not know were going to be there, and sometimes victories. And there are people in this church who I might not have ever had a friendship or a fellowship with out in the general population, but because of our serving together in this church, there are times we can just look at each other on a Sunday morning and know there's this common fellowship, this common service, this common challenge, this common mountaintop we walked over or this valley we walked through together, and know there's this fellowship because of it. Something special about that, folks. Something really, really special about the fellowship we get involved with when we get involved in a new work. I don't know what God might be calling you to in your life. I don't know what opportunities God might be opening up for you, particularly through the fellowship of the body of Christ. But I'm telling you, if you say yes, you may very well develop friendships with people that you never even considered before, simply because of the fellowship. Look at verse 4. And so while Paul was living with Priscilla and Aquila, right, while he was living with them, making tents, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. So every Saturday, of course, he would not be working that day, so he went into the synagogue and he began to reason. That word reason is the idea of dialogue. Not argue. Really, it's actually the Greek word diolegomai, which we get dialogue from that, and it speaks of interacting. He did not blow up in there and begin to shout and holler. He was having it just kind of a logical dialogue with the people. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded, or tried to persuade, to move or affect by words. By the way, this word often refers to moving people by kind words. It would seem the conversation Paul was having here was gracious and gentle and kind and loving. So I think sometimes we get the idea, and here's Paul busting up in there, kicking chairs over and taking names and all that kind of. No, he's actually dialoguing with people with kind, generous, gentle words, much the same way he did in Athens that we considered back in chapter 17. And so here he is dialoguing with the people. Verse 5, Silas and Timothy show up, right? Whew, good thing, because now Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia. Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. So it would seem that when Silas and Timothy showed up, now they can do some of the work, and Paul can just preach full time. He had to have some kind of financial support. And Silas and Timothy did a lot of that, and then Paul could kind of be free to preach full time. Verse 6, but when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads, I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Here's the situation. Paul was graciously, kindly, lovingly dialoguing with them about the gospel, and they decided they didn't want to hear it anymore, and they were ready to run him out. Let me suggest to you, if you're attempting to share the gospel with someone who has no interest in hearing from you, if you're attempting to share the gospel with someone who has no patience to listen to you, I'm telling you, you need to step back, you pray for them if you want, and let it go and find someone who's open. Because I got to tell you, the harvest is plentiful, folks. The harvest is plentiful. And if you've got someone in front of you you're trying to share the gospel with who's irate about it and doesn't want to hear it, by God's grace, you can let them go and go on to the next person, because there are some folks out there who want to hear it. And we got to find them. And we got to share the gospel with them. Well, Pastor Johnny, that just seems so cold and unfeeling. No, it's not. What it is saying, I don't really have time to debate with someone who is antagonistic toward the gospel. So I just want to go to people whose hearts are already prepared. Maybe this person just isn't ready, and I'll let them go and pray for them. Maybe they'll be ready down the road. But let me find some folks who are at least open to the gospel, even if they're lost and not ready. At least we'll listen. That's what Paul did. But listen to this. I just shared with you the opportunity of fellowship in a new work. You ready? But there's the challenge of outward opposition. You are going to face outward opposition, sometimes inward, sometimes outward opposition in a new work. I can't tell you what that's going to be. I can't tell you what that's going to look like. There are 100 different ways that you can experience opposition, but we know that Paul did as he got involved in this new work in Corinth. Listen, the opposition you could get could be apathy. I just thought about this morning. Do you know sometimes the opposition we get in the church is actually apathy among people who are a part of this church? People who just don't really seem to care that much about either being here or serving. You know, apathy is a form of opposition. When God's people simply stop attending and being part of the ministry here because they're unconcerned about the work, let me tell you what it does. It is discouraging to the fellowship. So that certainly can be opposition. Can I suggest to you that when you become apathetic about the work of the church, you become an opponent to the work of the church? I'm not trying to heap some guilt. I'm just stating a fact, really. It is an experience I've seen happen over and over again. So sometimes the opposition you might get is apathy. You're involved in a ministry, you're excited about it, and then there are people who really don't care. Let me suggest to you, don't you dare allow that to cause you to stop. Just because some have fallen away and don't care doesn't mean God hasn't called you to that ministry. Doesn't mean you're not still supposed to keep trucking on in it as you go. You know, sometimes you can have personal attacks. You can be involved in a ministry. Maybe someone's criticizing you the way you're doing that ministry. Maybe someone is criticizing you, the church you're a part of. Maybe someone's criticizing you the steps you take. You know, over the last decade, I have had, in this church body over the last decade, I have had 4 different times where some of our black brethren and sisters have come to me and said, Pastor, you know, I was asked, why are you going to that church with that white pastor? And I got to tell you, all 4 times, I was told this, that folks came to me and told, Pastor, I wanted to share this with you. All 4 times, do you know what they answered? I love this, Pastor Mike. I love this. They said, you know why I'm going there? Because he preaches the word. I said, you go on. Woo! But you know what? When the people ask that, they're trying to criticize you for where you're attending. They're trying to criticize you for where you're going. Sometimes opposition can be spiritual opposition, right? By the way, we fight spiritual opposition with worship, with prayer, and with the preaching and teaching of the Word. That's spiritual opposition. Those are spiritual weapons that we fight. If you're not involved, by the way, can I suggest to you, if you're not involved in a prayer meeting at Green Acres Baptist Church, I encourage you, I exhort you to consider plugging into one. And if you can't be a part of any of the prayer meetings that are going on now because of the time or whatever, let me know. We'll start a new one. We have a men's prayer meeting that meets on Sunday or on Tuesday mornings at 6:30 a.m. I know that's early. I know that's difficult sometimes for many of you. You're trying to get kids to school. You have to get to work at a certain time. But if you can be there, that, best I can tell, that prayer meeting has been going on at Green Acres for at least 40 years, since the late 40 years. How many of you know what I know? How many spiritual victories have been won at Green Acres Baptist Church through that prayer meeting on Tuesday mornings? We have a women's prayer meeting that meets at 5:20. Is that right? Right here. 5:20. It has not been going on as long, but it is here. It meets over also in C Hall in that conference room, which is where the men's prayer meeting meets. We should be having revival in that room, Pastor, with all the prayer meetings happening in that room. That's another one you could come be a part of. We have pastors' prayer partners. Dave Curry kind of heads that up. There are two prongs to that. One is a group of people who meet before our worship services, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and pray. Another part of the pastors' prayer meetings involves our Sunday school classes, and our Sunday school classes kind of have certain months that they're dedicated to praying for the pastors and families. We have right now, while we're meeting in here, we have one of our deacons who is assigned in the prayer room. Some of you may or may not know this. We have a prayer room you can access 24 hours a day on the Green Acres campus. If you want to know how to access it, give us a call tomorrow and we'll give you instructions. I'm not going to try to do that right now. But we have a deacon in our prayer room every Sunday morning who's praying during our worship service, lifting this service up before the Lord. And on it goes. And some of our Sunday school classes meet early to pray. And if you're not plugged in to a public prayer meeting, somehow, some way, can I suggest to you that you find a way? And if you can't be at any of the prayer meetings the times I've mentioned, let me know. And we'll find out how we can start another one along the way. And I want to mention something else, first time in public consumption, although I did mention it to my Sunday school class this morning. In the next month or so, we're about to introduce really a new element to our Sunday morning worship service. We'll talk to you more about that in the weeks ahead. Pastor Mike and I are kind of working out the logistics on it. But we want to make public prayer a greater priority in our Sunday morning worship service. And so in the next few weeks, you'll hear more about that. We're going to begin to add an element along the way. I can't wait because I just think we want to prioritize prayer in these Sunday morning worship services as we go. By the way, that's how we fight spiritual opposition. It's through prayer and the preaching of the Word. Let me give you one more attack that you might get being involved in a new ministry. Pessimism. Just negativity. Pastor, your church, there's a lot of crime in that area of town. I got a question for you. Horribly, I read in a news report that I think Thursday night there was a murder that took place out in Bon Air. I got to ask you a question. Where are you going to go where people don't commit crimes? Where are you going to go? And by the way, even if you can go there, is that where God's called us to go? Seems to me the gospel needs to go where people are committing the crimes, where they need the Lord. Seems to me we need to take the fire hose and run to the fire rather than running away from it. Seems to me we need to take the medicine and run to the sick people rather than away from them. And so don't let pessimism discourage you from being involved in new ministry, a new place, or a new work. Look at verse 8. So the challenge of outward opposition is one of the challenges. Verse 8 through 11, you ready? The opportunity of spiritual success. So we've had the opportunity of fellowship, the challenge of outward attack, and the opportunity now of spiritual success. Verse 8. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. Need I explain to you what a huge stinking deal this is? One of the synagogue leaders got saved. One of the synagogue leaders got converted. It would be like if we walked down to the local mosque and led the imam to Christ and got saved and he joined Green Acres. I mean, it's a big deal. And so it says, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. We've got some spiritual success going on. I don't know what ministry you're involved in or what ministry you have been involved in or what ministry you're about to be involved in. And I understand sometimes there are these seasons of sowing and sometimes it feels like you'll just never really see the great success that you believe can happen. But I'm telling you, it's going to happen eventually if you'll do what God's called you to do and just keep your hand to the plow and pressing forward. Ultimately, you're going to see victory. I don't know what it'll look like. But look at verse 9. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid. Let me ask you a question. If he tells Paul, do not be afraid, what can we suggest may have been happening in Paul's mind? Fear. Good principle for Bible study. make sure you pick out the most obvious things. Sometimes we're in Bible studies and you ask a question, and people want to go into these deep, secondary spiritual ideas, this deep theological thoughts. I'm thinking, look, just kind of, first of all, pick out the most obvious stuff. And just most obvious, if he says, do not be afraid, that suggests to me that maybe Paul was afraid. The Apostle Paul, the great Apostle Paul, was facing fear. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. You reckon why God told him that there in Corinth when there were other cities Paul was in that they about killed him? How come here he tells Paul nobody's going to hurt you, but in other cities they did? I don't know the answer to that question except God. God does what he does, and he does it for his purposes, and he does it in a way that will bring about victory. Look at verse 11. And he, that is Paul, continued there 1 year and 6 months. How long is that? It's 18 months, right? There's only one church that Paul spent more time at, and that's Ephesus. He would spend 18 months at this church teaching the Word of God among them, the opportunity of spiritual success. Pastor, I don't know if I get involved in this ministry if it will be successful. Well, I'll tell you this. If you don't get involved, I guarantee you won't get to experience the success. Now, if you get involved in the ministry, you may face trials, you may face challenges, but if you're obeying God, that's success. I can't tell you what it'll look like. I can't tell you what'll happen, but I will guarantee you, if you sit idly by in this church and don't get involved, you will never experience any success because you're uninvolved. How about the opportunity of spiritual success when we get involved in a new work? And then look at verse 12. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. Now we got trouble, right? Wait, God, I thought you told Paul he wasn't going to be hurt. He's not hurt yet. This fellow, verse 13, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. That's a lie. Okay, it's a lie. I got that. Stop being so concerned when people say things that are dishonest about you or your church or Christianity. Stop trying to go and fix it. Stop. But Pastor, you know what they said about me? I think I just need to go say. One of the things I learned as a pastor a long time ago, there are some things I can sit and I can talk with someone and I can fix in terms of things they've said, but there are a lot of stuff it's a waste of time. Spend too much time trying to prove yourself right. So verse 14, when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or of wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves. For I do not want to be a judge of such matters. And he drove them from the judgment seat. Paul did not have to defend himself. God used this leader, this political leader, to defend him. That's funny. Who would have ever thought of that? Who would have ever thought that one of the Roman leaders was going to defend Paul? He said, look, if you're bringing this guy before me because of your religion, you're wasting my time. Get out of here. This isn't about law. This is about your religion. Now get out of here and take care of it yourselves. Let me tell you what they did. Bless Sosthenes' little heart. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. By the way, 1 Corinthians 1:1, guess who gets saved? Old Sosthenes. He does. In 1 Corinthians 1:1, Paul mentions him. Earlier, Crispus got saved. I don't even know who's going to lead the synagogue anymore, Pastor Mike. All those leaders are getting saved in Corinth. But watch this. There's the challenge of public perception. When you get involved in a new ministry, when you get involved in, especially a ministry that may be unusual or abnormal. We've got a ministry right now going on that involves ministering to victims of human trafficking. I got to tell you, that's not really one of those things that just punches people's buttons, that gets them all excited. It's not one of those pretty ministries. It's one of those that deals with some of the seediest, worst parts of our culture. But what difference does it make of what the culture says if we're obeying God? So sometimes we get involved in ministries that maybe the culture doesn't like, or they're making fun of, or they're saying things about. The public perception. Do you know when I came to Green Acres, there was public perception out there? Oh, that Green Acres, I've heard it's really down, it's really declined. I don't care what people think. I could care less what people outside think. All I care about is what God's telling us to do here. And we've seen Him do it for a long time. And I believe the latter is going to be greater than the former, by the way. I don't care what the public perception is. Now, to some degree, we do care about our testimony in front of the city, our integrity, our love for the Lord, our testimony. Okay, we do care what people think on that. But as far as people's opinion, if we're obeying God, as far as people's opinion about what we do or don't do, I don't care. I really don't. I'm the same way as a parent. Some people might not like certain steps we take, the way we relate to our kids, the way we take them, and I've shared this with some of you. I've shared this with my leadership. Maybe people don't like, how we school them or whatever. As long as we're biblically leading them, I really don't care what people think, because one day Alyssa and I are going to stand before the Lord on what we've done with our children. And so even if someone's opinion of the way I raise my children, maybe I should discipline them more, maybe I should discipline them less, whatever, ultimately it doesn't matter, because what matters is what God thinks. Same way in this church body. If I'm involved in ministry and people out there like or don't like it, I can't control that. What I can control is if we're seeking the Lord. Starting a new ministry or a new work in a lost culture will contain challenges and opportunities. How many of you have ever heard the name George Washington Carver? George Washington Carver. He's actually often tied to the Tuskegee University that was started by Booker T. Washington. George Washington Carver was born into slavery. Let me read you a few details about George Washington Carver. He was born sometime in the 1860s, doesn't know exactly when, did not know exactly when. He was born to Moses Carver. It was a German American who purchased his parents and his family for $700. Historian Linda O. McMurray noted this. Listen to her account of George Washington Carver. He was a frail and sickly child who suffered from a severe case of whooping cough and frequent bouts of what has been called croup. McMurray contested the diagnosis of croup, saying that rather his stunted growth and apparently impaired vocal cords suggested either tubercular or pneumococcal infection. So he was not one of those kids who was precocious and early on, really just took off out of the starting blocks, did he? When George was only a week old, there were some night raiders, as they were called then, from Arkansas, came across the border and kidnapped his entire family, everybody except his older brother. Took off to Kentucky and sold his family as slaves and dispersed them. But his master, Moses Carver, sent a private eye or some kind of a law enforcement agent to look for him. He was able to recover George and bring him back. When slavery was outlawed and the Civil War was over, George's masters actually raised he and his older brother like their children. And they encouraged them this way. This is one word that George Washington Carver said he never forgot, that they encouraged George to continue his intellectual pursuits and taught him the basics of reading and writing. At that time, he was not allowed to attend school locally because he was black. And so he traveled 10 miles away into Neosho. When he reached the town, it was night and the school was closed. He slept in a nearby barn. And by his own account, the next morning he met a kind woman named Mariah Watkins, from whom he rented a room. She made a great, great impression on him. She told him this. She said, "You must learn all you can and then go out into the world and give your learning back to the people." And if you know anything about the biographical details of George Washington Carver's life, he did that. He would eventually become a professor at the Tuskegee Institute prior to it becoming Tuskegee University. And he would find alternate crops for poor farmers to raise so that their soil didn't become exhausted in nutrients. Particularly, he developed a cookbook with 105 food recipes using peanuts. Some people think he invented peanut butter. He did not. Peanut butter has actually been around since the Aztecs, believe it or not. But he invented all kinds of other ways for use of the peanut. But you know what caught me most when I read his biography? It was this. He believed he could have both faith in God and science integrated into his life. This was the beginning of Darwin's Origin of Species had just come out. This was the beginning of the rise in Darwinism. And yet Carver believed he could be a Christian. He testified on many occasions that his faith in Jesus was the only mechanism by which he could effectively pursue and perform the art of science. He did not even believe you could be a scientist without being a born-again believer. Carver became a Christian when he was a young boy. Let me read to you his own account, his autobiographical account. I was just a mere boy when I was converted, hardly 10 years old. There isn't much of a story to it. God just came into my heart one afternoon while I was alone in the loft of our big barn. I was shelling corn to carry to the mill to be ground into meal. If you can get born again while you're shucking corn, it must be real. I got to tell you, because that's not that much fun. He says, a dear little white boy, one of our neighbors about my age, came by one Saturday morning, and in talking and playing, he told me he was going to Sunday school the next morning. I was eager to know what a Sunday school was. He said they sang hymns and prayed. I asked him what prayer was and what they said. I do not remember what he said. I only remember that as soon as he left, I climbed up into the loft, knelt down by the barrel of corn and prayed as best I could. I do not remember what I said. I only recall that I felt so good that I prayed several times before I quit. My brother and myself were the only colored children in that neighborhood, and of course, we could not go to church or Sunday school or school of any kind. That was my simple conversion, and I have tried to keep the faith. This was written in a letter to a friend of his, July 24th, 1931. I look at his life, and I see many opportunities, and I see many challenges, new things he would take on. And here's the reality, folks. If you're going to get involved in ministry, if you're going to get involved in what God's called you to do, in George Washington Carver's case, God called him to science. God called him to be involved in this, and he believed that. And there were challenges. Oh, there were challenges he faced that maybe none of us will ever have to face. Not like he did. But there were also opportunities that he experienced because he didn't allow the challenges to make him quit. So I'm going to encourage you this morning, whatever God has you in, maybe it's a ministry you're already involved in, maybe it's a ministry you're looking toward, maybe it's some step of obedience He's calling you to. I'm telling you, there are going to be opportunities involved and there are going to be challenges. But what we can't ever do is be surprised at the challenges and allow them to make us step back, step aside, or stop. And so I'm saying to you this morning, Green Acres, I pray that as a church body and you as individuals, that we would be people who say, I'm just not going to back up because who knows what God has around the corner. And so if you're here today and you don't know Christ as your Savior, today's a great day. In just a moment, I'm going to pray. We're going to stand. You can come. If you're here and you would like to really just ask God to examine your heart before we observe the Lord's Supper, the guidelines for the Lord's Supper, you need to be born again. You need to be surely born again. You need to know Christ as your Savior. As much as you know, you need to be at peace with the people in this fellowship. If there's any unconfessed sin in your life you've not dealt with, now's the time. And as the plates come by later, as the bread comes by and the cup comes by, if those things in your life aren't right, if you let it pass by, I'll have more respect for you than if you go ahead and observe it because you're afraid of what people might think or whatever. But today's a time to examine yourself as we prepare for the Lord's Supper. Pray with me. Father, right now in Jesus' name, Lord, let us obey you and prepare for your table. You stand right where you are. You stand.